And then God said, let us make man in our image, after our likeness. And it's our because, well, this is part of the priestly story. There's, as I said, a number of sources for the Old Testament. And in the priestly version, if I remember correctly, it's Elohim. That may be wrong. It doesn't matter, but precisely it doesn't matter, because the notion is that the God who's in the background of this story has a kind of plurality of being, right? And it looks like the idea of monotheism arose with great difficulty across time, because there are lots of powers, and the idea that there's a power of powers was something that it wasn't easy for people to figure out, you know, and because what's constant across sources of power? Well, some kind of meta power, but it's hard to figure out what that is, and that's what's being represented by the movement, as far as I can tell, from polytheism to monotheism. It's the observation that there are powers that determine the destiny of people, at least in part, that you're subject to. And then the idea that there's something common across all those powers that you can represent partly, say, with the idea of the sun rising in the morning and fighting its way out of the darkness at night, and that's associated with consciousness and sovereignty. It's very, very... See, one of the things that bothers me about simple-minded atheism, and I would say the simple-minded atheism is of the sort that regards these stories as nothing but simple superstitions, is that it's very, very poorly informed. Because whatever these stories are, they are not merely simple superstitions. They weren't conjured up by some cabal of priests to bamboozle the masses, even though they were used for that purposes from time to time. It's much, much more complicated than that. They have a very ancient lineage, and they're tied together with all sorts of other stories. And there's an emergent wisdom in them, and I think the right way to view them is as the birthplace of sophisticated philosophical ideas. And so you have to wrestle with these stories. You can't just... And I said already that I'm going to be as rational as I possibly can in my discussion of these stories, and not refer to anything metaphysical except when that's absolutely necessary, even though I don't want to eliminate the possibility of a metaphysical reality, because I think that's premature. But you have to take the stories seriously if you're going to approach the problem properly. You can't just casually dismiss them. It's not appropriate. And so let us make man in our image. That's a very interesting idea. And like I said, it's not easy to understand how it was that human beings came up with the idea that us lowly creatures were... So with the Mesopotamians, for example, and the Greeks were like this too. Human beings weren't godlike. They were the playthings of the gods, right? They were just... The gods just tortured us for their amusement, you know. Love and hatred and anger and all those powerful forces. We were just playthings to the gods. There wasn't anything particularly divine about us. The notion that in some sense we partake of the divine that's a staggering idea. And you don't want to underestimate the difficulty that there was in abstracting that, or the utility of that idea for our current mode of being. Let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over the livestock, and all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. That's interesting because there is more than one creation story in Genesis, and in this story, males and females are basically created at the same time. Later, Eve is extracted out of Adam, and we'll talk about that, but not here. It's the two sexes are generated simultaneously, and they both carry within them the divine stamp, which is very egalitarian and very appropriate, and I think unbelievably advanced. That's what it looks like to me. And God blessed them. Well, that's a good thing. And God said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the heavens and over every living thing that moves on the earth. And there's God creating Adam and Eve, and they're looking pretty happy about the whole thing. And that's Michelangelo's famous Sistine Chapel representation. And there's some cool things about this. I mean, you got to wonder, this is an aside, and I don't know if it's a credible aside, but it's an interesting aside, so that's a form of credible. What the hell is God doing in this thing? You know, I mean, what is this exactly? And so there's been some interesting answers to that, and this is one of them. So there was a group of scientists about 20 years ago that were remarked on the precise analogy between this structure and the brain bisected down the middle. And of course, Michelangelo was one of the first people who did detailed dissections, and so they felt that Michelangelo had put God inside the brain for some reason, and that seems to me to be associated with the notion that there's an analogy or a metaphorical identity between the notion of whatever God is and the structures that give rise to consciousness. And I think we really underestimate the degree to which consciousness is both, say, miraculous and not understood. I mean, you have what appears to be an entirely material substrate, yet here you are, aware and self-aware and able to generate the world merely in some sense by looking at it. It really is remarkable, and that consciousness is dependent on something that wells up from deep within that material substrate that we don't understand at all. It's really it's a crazily remarkable thing.